A group of men in robes are standing over a small clay furnace, trying to create a potion that will let the emperor live forever. Instead, they create something that will eventually let human beings kill each other from 300 meters away. Nobody in that room understood what they had just done. And that's the story we're telling today. Because the actual history is far stranger, far bloodier, and far more accidental than anything you learned in school. So how did ancient humans, without steel factories or chemistry degrees, end up inventing the gun? The honest answer is that they weren't trying to. What actually happened is a chain of accidents, obsessions, and desperate improvisation stretching across nearly 2,000 years. And once you see the whole chain, you'll never look at a firearm the same way again. Let's start with the wrong beginning, because most people assume this story starts with metal. It doesn't. It starts with wood, fire, and a problem humans have had since the very first hunt. How do you kill something from far away before it can kill you? For the vast majority of human existence, the answer was a sharpened stick. Early humans learned to fire-harden the tips of wooden spears as far back as 300,000 years ago, based on spear fragments discovered at a site in Schöningen, Germany. Long before Homo sapiens had fully emerged as a species, our ancestors were already engineering weapons, already thinking about range, velocity, and lethality. The desire to project force across distance, to kill without being killed in return, might be one of the oldest problems our species ever tried to solve. Then came the next leap. Somewhere around 20,000 years ago, humans invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that used leverage to fling a dart with dramatically more force and range than a human arm alone could manage. This wasn't just a stick with a spear in it, it was a machine, turning a weak human throw into something that could punch through the hide of a mammoth. Here's the part that should make you pause. The atlatl is, structurally, doing the same job a gun does. It takes a small amount of human energy and converts it, through engineering, into a projectile moving fast enough to be lethal at a distance. Humans had already figured out the concept of a firearm, they just hadn't figured out the fire part yet. The bow and arrow followed, storing energy and releasing it instantly, with accuracy a thrown spear could never match. And around the same period in tropical regions of Southeast Asia and the Americas, completely unrelated groups of humans independently arrived at another solution: the blowgun, a hollow tube that used compressed air from a person's own lungs to send a dart flying with surprising force. Different continents, no contact between the cultures who invented them, and yet the underlying logic was identical: contain energy, release it suddenly, send something small and lethal down a straight line. That's convergent evolution of an idea, the same way wings evolved independently in birds, bats, and insects. When a problem is important enough, separate groups of humans arrive at strikingly similar answers. By the time actual civilizations were forming, humans had already spent hundreds of centuries perfecting the delivery of a projectile. What they were missing wasn't the ambition, it was the ingredient. And the ingredient, when it finally showed up, arrived by complete accident in a place nobody would expect, for a reason that has nothing to do with war at all. There's an earlier piece of this puzzle that most people never hear about, and it has nothing to do with chemistry. For centuries before gunpowder existed, people across China threw green bamboo stalks into a fire. As the bamboo heated, trapped air and sap inside its hollow segments would expand until the stalk burst apart with a loud crack. These natural bamboo explosions were used, long before any chemical formula existed, to scare off evil spirits, wild animals, and a mythical mountain-dwelling creature blamed for spreading illness. The culture that would eventually discover gunpowder had already spent generations treating loud, sudden, contained explosions as a tool. So when gunpowder came along, the idea wasn't as foreign as it might otherwise have been. Gunpowder just made that burst dramatically more powerful and considerably more lethal. Somewhere around the 9th century, in Tang Dynasty China, a group of Daoist alchemists were doing what alchemists across nearly every ancient civilization were obsessed with doing. They were trying to create an elixir of immortality, not a weapon, a potion. One of the substances they experimented with was a mixture of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, a naturally occurring mineral known today as potassium nitrate. According to a Chinese military text called the Wujing Zongyao, compiled around 1044, alchemists were explicitly warned that mixing these three ingredients together was dangerous because doing so had already caused fires, burned beards, and burned down buildings. The earliest known written reference to gunpowder in human history is essentially a workplace safety warning. Stop mixing these things, it says, because people keep setting themselves on fire. Think about how strange that is. The most destructive chemical discovery in the pre-modern world wasn't the product of a military mind trying to build a weapon. It was the byproduct of a spiritual quest to escape death. The alchemists weren't hunting for gunpowder. Gunpowder found them. Once the danger became obvious, Chinese engineers redirected it. If this mixture could burn a beard off a face, it could obviously do something to an enemy. The first recorded military use of this compound wasn't a gun at all. It was fire. Soldiers packed the mixture into small containers and threw them, using gunpowder as a crude incendiary weapon, closer to a modern firebomb than a firearm. Then came the next leap, where the story starts bending towards something recognizable. Chinese engineers began packing gunpowder into bamboo tubes, attaching them to spears, and pointing them at the enemy. When ignited, these tubes projected flame and burning debris several feet forward in a controlled direction. This weapon was called a fire lance, and it first appears in the historical record around the 10th century. A tube, a propellant, a directed explosive force aimed at a target, that is structurally already a gun, more flamethrower than firearm, but the core concept had already been born. The fire lance evolved fast because war is an efficient teacher. Engineers noticed that if you packed small projectiles, pottery shards, scraps of metal, pebbles, into the barrel along with the gunpowder, the weapon didn't just burn the enemy, it launched debris into them with enough force to wound or kill. That's the moment fire lances stopped being flame weapons and started becoming something closer to what we'd recognize as a firearm. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Chinese armies were using bamboo and later bronze tubes packed with gunpowder and shrapnel in actual battles, including during the Mongol invasions that swept across Asia. The Mongols encountered these weapons, understood their value almost immediately, and helped carry the technology westward across their empire through trade routes and captured engineers forced to explain how the devices worked. Gunpowder didn't just spread. It was dragged across an entire continent by one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, almost as a side effect of conquest. By the time gunpowder weapons reached the Middle East and eventually Europe in the 13th century, the core problem had already shifted. It was no longer whether this substance existed. It was how to build a container strong enough to survive the explosion and precise enough to aim it. European metalworkers, already skilled at casting bronze for church bells, applied that knowledge to build the first true hand cannons. Solid metal tubes with a small hole for ignition, designed to hurl a metal ball at a target. A tube of bamboo becomes a tube of bronze. A weapon designed to burn an enemy becomes a weapon designed to punch a hole straight through one. We actually have physical proof of how far this technology had gotten by the late 13th century. In 1970, archaeologists in Inner Mongolia uncovered a bronze cannon, roughly 35 centimeters long, dated to around 1298, now generally referred to as the Xanadu Gun. It has an ignition hole, a barrel bore sized to fire a projectile, and inscriptions identifying it as military equipment. It is, As far as the physical record shows us, the oldest confirmed handheld firearm on Earth, and it looks crude and slightly terrifying, exactly what you'd expect from a weapon still only 2 centuries removed from a monk's failed immortality experiment. And once this technology reached Europe, it quietly ended an entire era. For hundreds of years, castles and heavy armor had defined military power. A thick stone wall could resist arrows indefinitely, and plate armor could deflect a sword strike without much trouble. Gunpowder respected neither. Cannons could reduce a castle wall to rubble in hours, something that would have taken a siege army months with older methods. Centuries of military architecture and personal armor became obsolete within a few generations, all because of a mixture 3 alchemists had once been warned not to combine in the same room. Here's the part of this story that almost nobody sits with long enough to appreciate. Every single stage of this chain was driven by people solving an immediate, narrow problem with no concept of where it would end. Nobody was working toward a gun. Everybody was solving the problem directly in front of them, and the gun assembled itself, piece by piece, across centuries, out of unrelated decisions made by people who never met each other and never shared a single unified goal. That's genuinely unsettling, because it means the most consequential weapon in human history wasn't designed. It emerged. It crept forward through trial, error, war, and a healthy amount of pure luck, the same way so much of human technology actually develops, not as a straight line from genius to invention, but as a messy, accidental staggering forward. There's an uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of all of this. The single substance that eventually gave humans the ability to kill each other at a distance, cheaply and at industrial scale, was discovered by people trying to defeat death itself. Historians estimate that firearms have been involved in conflicts responsible for tens of millions of deaths since, a number that would have horrified the monks who first mixed sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, searching for the opposite outcome entirely. The instinct behind both the elixir and the explosive was in a strange way the same instinct: control over life and death. One path was supposed to grant it. The other ended up taking it away at scale forever. There's one more layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. Those same Daoist alchemists never stopped experimenting after gunpowder was discovered. Some kept searching for the elixir of immortality for centuries afterward, seemingly undeterred by the fact that their own laboratories had already produced the most efficient tool for ending a human life the world had ever seen. It's a strange kind of tunnel vision, chasing eternal life while holding the ingredients for the opposite outcome in your own hands. But that's often how discovery works. The far larger question, what else could this substance do, gets answered almost as an afterthought by someone else entirely, sometimes centuries later. By the 14th century, gunpowder weapons had spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe almost simultaneously, adapted independently by different cultures who each pushed the technology in slightly different directions. Chinese engineers refined fire lances and early cannons. Middle Eastern armies developed some of the earliest true handheld firearms. European blacksmiths, driven by constant warfare between rival kingdoms, rapidly improved barrel strength, ignition, and accuracy, turning a crude tube into something recognizably close to the firearms that would reshape colonization, conquest, and the balance of power across the planet for the next 600 years. What's remarkable, looking back across the whole arc of this story, is how little any of it was planned. From a fire-hardened stick 300,000 years ago, to a mechanical spear thrower 20,000 years ago, to a monk's failed immortality potion in a Chinese laboratory, to a bamboo tube strapped to a spear, to a bronze cylinder capable of launching metal at lethal speed, every single step was a reaction to whatever problem was sitting directly in front of a person at that exact moment. Nobody was chasing the gun. The gun was chasing them quietly, patiently, through 1,000 years of unrelated human ambition, until one day it simply existed, fully formed in the hands of people who had inherited a chain of accidents they never chose and could never have predicted. So, how did ancient humans accidentally invent guns? They didn't set out to. They set out to hunt from farther away. They set out to win a war with fire instead of blades. They set out to live forever. And somewhere in the overlap of those three completely unrelated goals, across 2,000 years and three separate continents, one of the most consequential technologies in human history quietly assembled itself out of spare parts nobody realized belonged to the same machine. That's the truth hiding underneath almost every major invention we now consider obvious. Nothing about it was obvious at the time. It was accidents stacked on accidents until the accident became inevitable. If this kind of story is your thing, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel exists entirely to dig up stories like this one. Now I want to hear from you. Knowing that gunpowder was discovered by monks trying to invent eternal life, do you think history is actually driven more by accident than by intention? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.